Little Fox.
Black Beauty, Chapter 11, At the Hotel. The day arrived to start our journey to visit the squire's friends. John and James hitched Ginger and me to the carriage. Then James drove us to the front doors of the house where the squire and his wife were waiting. They got in, and we were off. We were on the road all day. There were some steep hills along the way, but James drove very carefully. And he always kept us on the smoothest part of the road. If the uphill was long, he turned the carriage to the side to let us rest for a moment. Ginger and I were grateful for his thoughtfulness. It made our job easier. Just as the sun was going down, we reached a town.
"We'll stop here for the night,"
the squire said.
"Take us to the hotel, please, James."
"Yes, sir,"
James said. He drove us through the streets and beneath an archway that led into the courtyard of a large hotel. We left the squire and his wife at the entrance, and then continued on to the stables at the back. A stable worker was waiting for us. He was a little old man with a crooked leg, but the leg didn't seem to bother him much. He was as active and lively as could be, rushing out to help James unhitch us.
"What a beauty you are,"
he told me in a friendly voice.
"Let's get you cleaned up so you can rest all right."
He led me into the stable. There were a number of stalls in there, with horses standing in several of them. Another worker brought Ginger in. He began to groom her while the little old man worked on me. James watched them both carefully. I have never been groomed as lightly and expertly as I was by that little old man. When he finished, James ran his hands over me.
"Wow,"
he said.
"I thought I was fast at grooming a horse, and my boss John even faster. But you put us both to shame."
"Practice makes perfect,"
the old man said with a chuckle.
"And I've had plenty of practice. I've been doing this for 40 years.
40 years?
James said, sounding impressed.
That's a long time.
"Yes, indeed,"
the old man agreed.
"I started at age 12. I've always been small, so I was a jockey for a while. But one day I was riding in a race when my horse slipped. I came off and broke my knee, and after that I couldn't ride anymore. But I couldn't live without horses, so I got a job at this hotel."
I can see that you do a good job here,
James said.
"Thank you, my boy,"
the old man said.
"I enjoy it, especially when I get the chance to handle an animal like this one.
He patted me.
If you let me handle a horse for a few minutes, I can always tell you what sort of treatment he's had. And I can tell this black horse of yours is well bred and was treated kindly."
After that, the old man put me in a stall and fed me. Ginger was in the stall beside me, and we were both glad to have a rest after our long day on the road. Later that evening, a different worker came in to give us more hay and water. Horses stood in every stall by now, and he was busy taking care of us all. Then a young man wandered in. He was smoking a pipe.
"Hello, Fowler,"
the worker greeted him.
"Could you do me a favor?"
"Sure. What is it?"
The young man let out a puff of smoke from his pipe.
"Climb up into the loft and toss down some more hay,"
the worker said.
"But be sure to set down your pipe first."
All right.
The young man hurried off out of sight. Just then, James came into the stable to check on Ginger and me.
Everything looks fine here,
he said, giving us each a pat.
"Get some rest, and I'll see you in the morning."
Shortly after he left, The stable went dark and quiet for the night. I ate a little more hay and then drifted off to sleep. I awoke some time later, feeling strangely uncomfortable. At first I wasn't sure why. I stood, coughing. A moment later, Ginger coughed too. The air was thick with smoke, and a crackling sound came from the loft overhead. Suddenly there was a cry from somewhere outside.
Fire!
Black Beauty, Chapter 12. Fire! Smoke filled the stable. The other horses were restless and coughing. It was dark, and all the smoke made it impossible to see what was happening. I coughed again. It was hard to breathe. The crackling and snapping sound overhead was getting louder. I didn't know what it was, but it terrified me. I think it scared the other horses too. They all started stamping, whinnying, or kicking at their stalls. I heard rushing footsteps outside. A moment later, the younger stable worker burst in. The fresh air he brought with him made it easier to breathe, but I was still very frightened. The worker grabbed the first horse in the row and tried to lead him out. But that horse was as scared as I was and refused to go. After a moment, the man gave up and went to the next stall. But that horse pulled back as well, and so did the next. Finally, the man came to my stall. He darted in and reached for my halter, but I whirled away. When he tried again, he managed to grab it. He gave a tug for me to follow. I refused, planting my feet where they were. I didn't know him, and I was too frightened to trust a stranger. I wasn't going anywhere. Now I realize how foolish that was. The stable worker was only trying to rescue all the horses. But at the time, we were out of our minds with fear. That terrible crackling sound was all around, and it seemed safer to stay in my stall than risk getting closer to whatever was causing it. My stall had always been a safe place, whether at home or on the road. How was I to know that it was different this time? Finally, the worker gave up. He rushed out of the stable again, shouting for help. A moment later, the old man with the crooked leg came in. He was much calmer than the other man had been. He walked up to the first horse and talked to her softly. A second later, the mare went with him, though she still looked anxious. The old man led her outside, then returned and went to the second horse. At the same time, James hurried in and came to my stall.
Come, my beauties, it's time to get out of here.
He said to Ginger and me in his usual calm, cheerful voice. I was glad to see him, but I was still feeling very nervous. James pulled the scarf from around his neck and slipped it over my eyes so I couldn't see anything. I still heard the fire crackling, but the sound of James talking softly to me was closer and much more familiar. I decided to trust James and let him tell me what to do. After all, he had never let me down before. So I allowed him to lead me out, and a moment later, there was fresh air all around me.
Somebody hold this horse while I go back in,
James called, pulling the scarf off my eyes so I could see again. A man stepped up to take me, and James ran back into the burning stable. I was still feeling scared and uncertain, and I didn't want him to go, so I whinnied after him. Later, Ginger told me that my whinny was what had saved her. Knowing that I was outside, she found the courage to follow James out of her stall. Through the smoke, I watched the doorway. A moment later, James and Ginger appeared in the doorway. By now, the entire roof was blazing. We could hear things collapsing inside. Someone called out that the fire engine was on its way. The little old man was bringing other horses out, but we didn't stay to watch any longer. The squire had appeared, and he and James led Ginger and me to a different hotel. In the morning, all the humans were talking about what had happened. The stable workers had gotten most of the other horses out, but 2 had been lost in the fire. I was glad that Ginger and I were safe in a different hotel stable, but I felt sad about those 2 horses. Everyone was sure that the young man's pipe had started the blaze. He said he'd put the pipe down before going up into the loft, just as the stable worker had asked. But nobody believed him. I was very glad that John had a strict rule at home about such things. Nobody was allowed to have a pipe or any other fire anywhere near the stable. I couldn't understand why that wasn't a rule at every stable. It certainly would have saved those 2 poor horses.